I really want to talk about how the system is broken. And she says to me, Senna, the system is not broken. It's operating how it was meant to.
Andragogy is a thing. Anglonormativity is a thing. The fact that we all are expected to simply know how to speak English and speak it at a particular level in a particular accent for it to be considered legitimate.
One of the things we explicitly do is think about the fact that our schools have become more multiracial, but they haven't become more multicultural.
Welcome back to another episode of Colorful, a podcast where we unpack race, privilege, and power. I am Senamile Zungu, joined here by my millennial bestie, Stacey Jane. Stace, what's the qua?
Oh, it's in each week. I don't even know where you come up with these things. I have that one I really have never heard before, and I have no idea what it means. Completely can't relate to you, but I guess something that we can probably relate on, although I must admit across generations, so that is another layer, is an experience that would have shaped us and pretty much everybody alive in our country today. So whether you went to a rural school, a formal Model C school, a private school, and regardless of how you fared in maths, it's quite clear that we need to talk about education in our country.
Yes, Stace, I still get triggered by the get back to school ads and all that season. I still get so triggered by that. So anyway, I can only imagine you as a parent right there, back to school vibes. But today we really want to talk about the system of education, both as a tool of oppression, but also as a tool for freedom and emancipation. Because like Stace said, if you grew up in South Africa, you'll know that schooling is not just about reading and writing. It's more about who gets access, whose language gets to be used in the classroom, who gets to feel like they belong.
Yeah, and I guess with it being Youth Month, we want to and we have to acknowledge the students who literally put their bodies on the line to make sure that we have access to equal education and quality education for everybody. And I don't feel, and certainly not in the conversations that you and I have had many times over the past couple of years, Senna, that access to education is truly equal when we talk about the realities of how that access plays out.
Yes, Stace. So to unpack all of this, we are joined by two powerhouse women who are reimagining education from the inside out. We are joined by Katy Mthethwa, a founder of the organization Thrive Together. Katy was also a founding member of Thinking School South Africa and has developed training materials that have enabled teachers across the country to teach their curriculum with a thinking philosophy at its core and engage their students in a deeper experience of learning. Hello, Katy.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. So good to have you. And Courtney Koopman is also joining us today, a creative, a researcher, an educator, and a radical thinker. We love those here at Colourful. She has her master's from Edinburgh University, focused on education futures, and is also an Alan Gray Orbis Foundation Fellow and a voice that you need to hear today. So welcome, Courtney.
Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be in a circle of, powerful women ready to reflect on some really powerful considerations, particularly within learning ecosystems. So I'm really happy to be here.
Ah, ladies. Hey, we are in great company. Okay, and you guys know what is coming before we really dive into the detail here. We're talking red nails. Now's our time. Yeah, look at you guys.
Yay.
So prepared. Okay, so guys, as you know on the show, we ask our guests to paint one hand of their nails red. Why red? Because it's bold, it's energetic, it's courageous, and I feel like it speaks to intentionally entering spaces that feel uncomfortable and moving forward with purpose. So, not to say that I read too much into a color, but I feel like it's legit. So, do you ladies want to paint your one hand of nails red? And we will also take that opportunity to just have a little intro and a discussion on some top of mind thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to actually, just as you are painting your nails and in staying in line with the theme, and the youth of 76 who are so bold and brave, I want to ask all of you, what is the boldest or bravest thing you've ever done as a school going kid? Stacey, we start with you.
I don't think I was very brave at school, if I'm honest, Senna. The bravest thing I probably did was, but by the time I got to matric, and we was in the time of starting to study for our finals, I just kind of decided that to hell with maths. And so I skipped probably the last month of maths classes, and I went and painted in the art room, doing the stuff I really love. And then I did suffer a little bit. I think I paid for it, but it feels like that was certainly in the interests of my heart. What about you, Senna?
Rebellious. Stace, you know what? I think, okay, so this will definitely stand out as my bravest moment. I had a teacher, in my business studies teacher. She was teaching affirmative action, and, Black economic empowerment and the acts involved there. And I specifically remember her using the words reverse racism and telling the class that it is up to us to change this now reverse racist systems that exist. I remember calling her out and saying that what your job should be doing is teaching us the content of the subject matter without your opinion. And I remember walking out. And still to this day, I'll if I go back to my hometown of Newcastle, I'll see some old schoolmates, and they'll say, we remember you did that. So that's I'd say the only bravest, boldest thing I did, because I really cared about being a good student, and I'm such a people pleaser that always stands out to me. I can see the nails are painted, ladies. Can we do a close up?
Oh, it's
Yeah.
looking good. How do I close up? There we go.
There we go. Katie, you grew up in the UK. What is the boldest thing you did
Yeah.
at school?
So I was a very conformist child in many ways. I didn't do much that I would say was bold. Maybe the boldest thing was like at the end of school, not going to varsity. So I had the grades, and the natural thing was to go to university. I remember the school begging me to trying to find a degree that would interest me. But I honestly, my heart was in other things. There wasn't a degree that I wanted to go and do at that point. And so I only went to university when I was 26. That's when I went and did my primary education, BA honours in primary education. So that was again the end of my schooling, but that was pretty bold at the time, just to say no, I'm not going to university for the sake of it. I want to do what I'm crafted to do at this point in time.
That is
Sunny,
so
you look
brave.
shocked.
I know it's exactly, I am shocked because I think growing up, and this is probably one of the issues that we can say, or one of the ways we need to reimagine basic education. We put sort of kids through a pipeline of prepping them to be employees. And I certainly grew up in a generation where my parents didn't have access to so many different career paths. So it was driven in me that this is the pipeline towards a successful, fulfilling life. So I appreciate so much that at that age you knew that there is more than one way to be, and at different paths to how your life can look like. That's why I'm sitting here like, that's amazing. That is so bold.
Yeah, it's cool.
I,
I ended up with experience before becoming a teacher, and I think that in itself
Mm.
just shaped my teaching and my passion for it so greatly and deeply.
wow,
Yeah.
Courtney, and you?
Sure. I think toward the end of my high school career, I'd really become enemy of the state number one in many ways for the teachers at my school. But a particular thing I remember doing quite intentionally was I did design up until matric, and we had our final prac exam, and the project that I was focusing on conceptually was very radical. It was looking at Cape Town as my home city, and really considering how racism here is dressed up a certain way so that it's palatable for people who come from the outside. And so I'd graffitied this mural on the side of the school, and because it was my exam piece, they couldn't remove it, so they had to stay with that mural there for months and couldn't do anything about it because legally they had to mark it and invigilate it first. And it was this I graffitied this gorilla in chains on a platform, and it was like um, yeah, I think I captioned it something like the chains you choose to see and the ones you choose to not, like the ones you choose to ignore. And yeah, my teacher was like, yo, I don't know if I can back you, but go off, sis. Like, all the best to you. And it caused a lot of issues with like maintenance stuff. And they were like, well, this is too political. We can't have this up there. And I mean, I was the only person of color in my class. And so there was no one else around me who looked like me, who had that kind of lived experience. And so I remember that being like my final FU to the space of privilege that never really accepted me for who I was, but now couldn't do anything about this thing that I put on the wall. So yeah.
Oh my goodness, Courtney, I just absolutely love that story so very much.
So, ladies, I know we have a jam-packed interview coming up, but just very briefly, let's go beyond the bios. Tell us a little bit more about yourselves and your journey with education. Courtney, I'm gonna have you start us off.
Sure. So I'm the daughter of a teacher. My mom's been teaching for over 20 years, and so I had a very immediate experience of the challenges of the schools in my environment, in my community. So she's taught everywhere from Heideveld to Bonteheuwel to Delft to the inner city of Hillbrow in Johannesburg. And those kind of schools are wrought with intergenerational issues and like we understand accessibility in so many ways are just so limited. And so a lot of what my mother's job ended up becoming was trauma management rather than teaching. And so as a child witnessing this, I think it really fueled me to get a better understanding of what learning ecosystems were about, and like the kind of things that make that kind of trauma management a very real reality for so many kids across the country, because I understood that the solution would have to be interdisciplinary. And yeah, that's what led me to an education futures kind of focus in my practice. As someone that curates content, but also as someone that designs programs and learning programs, it was very important for me to understand what's moving in the global discourse around education, and how it functions at different tiers of privilege, in different mechanisms of privilege, and different technologies of privilege. And yeah, that's really what has steered my path, and has led me here so far.
Amazing. Thank you, Courtney. And Katy, do you want to give us a kind of view of who you are about beyond the bio?
Sure. So yeah, as I said, became a teacher later in life. My own education was in the UK and was mixed race, and yeah, it was a very multicultural environment in South London. And then as a teacher, I found myself. I was in the UK, and then when I moved here to South Africa, found myself teaching in St. Peter's Boys' School. And I'd always thought I would come after the things I'd done previously, working in Mozambique with street kids and whatever. I thought I would come and teach in an underprivileged school and make a difference there. I realised the error of my ways now. I found this post in it just came my way, and it gave me a platform to be part of founding Thinking School South Africa. And that has been pivotal for me in my journey, because I got to then visit so many schools, mainly Model C schools and private schools, and that gave me a window on what was happening in terms of pedagogy. So I then did spent some time with PEP has a bridging school program, and spent time mentoring and training in those programs. And then moving forward, I was asked to write this diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum. And then have spent the last 2 years getting that into schools around South Africa, create safe spaces to intentionally journey and unpack that so that we can move forward. Yeah.
Yeah, Katie, I
And
actually I love what you've done there, but also how you make some of those resources available through Thrive Together on your platforms. And I know recently the one that you did for Youth Day for children, I can't remember the grades. It was like grades 1 to 4, but I certainly took my kids through it, and it was just a very helpful resource to do exactly what to take what you're learning and kind of make it easily accessible for all families to use. So yeah, maybe a thank you.
yeah, and
Pleasure.
ladies, I am beyond thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you, because you understand the building blocks of what we're not getting right. In putting this conversation together, our chief strategist Sarah, I said these are the ideas I have, and I said I really want to talk about how the system is broken, and she says to me, Senna, the system is not broken. It's operating how it was meant to. And so I want to take our listeners on a journey to understanding those basics. And perhaps let's start with history and the architecture that was apartheid, because I believe this is the most damning. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 ensured that Black South Africans would receive inferior education. In the words of then Minister of Native Affairs, Hendrik Verwoerd, he said, there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the levels of certain forms of labor. Um, what a man. But Courtney, perhaps can you just explain to our listeners what this act means and the implication that it has on our education system today? You've briefly touched on it, but what does this actually mean in where we sit today?
I think maybe it would be meaningful to start just before that. Like the law, the act didn't just come to passing, right? There was a significant container crafted around that in the colonial pursuit of how we know and validate knowledge. And so by the time that language was weaponized, particularly against Black and Brown people who themselves are part of the architecture of Afrikaans, but that's a different conversation for a different day, there was a significant sentiment growing around violence in the space of learning. So what apartheid had created was a culture of violence associated primarily with learning. So you have an experience of learning that is inherently traumatic, simply because I have to demand how I would prefer to learn and what I would prefer to have access to learning. And so by the time that the act came and students were protesting the fact that they had segregated learning experiences that significantly reduced their access to any kind of meaningful work and livelihood after, um, I think there's so many tiers that we need to consider, and part of that is not just the theater of protest and what that had done by the time that the act had come to passing, but every subsequent protest since then, from 53 to Fees Must Fall to Roads Must Fall to Shackville TRC to the current protests that are still happening on campus for a lack of living space and a lack of educational management of people, because that's really what it is at the heart of it. This act was really about disenfranchising people from ways of legitimate knowing and legitimate access to being able to provide meaningfully for themselves and their families, but also to create cultures and communities of learning, beyond what was being imposed on them. And I think the fracture of that is still so significant today, inside the classroom and outside of the classroom, because of our relationship with language, our relationship with learning, our relationship with schooling. Because one would think your learning is synonymous with your schooling, but that's not always the case. Many people have to find ways of learning and knowing in very different environments to that which is structured and that which is curated. And so if we have to take it back to 53, I think from a lived experience, like when I asked my aunts and my parents what they were doing at the time, my grandparents, what they were doing at the time, it becomes very clear that there was a thread of angst and hostility that existed way before that act was passed, because you already knew the groundwork for that had already been laid by the time that act had come to passing. So the escalation from that point, I think politically and even within learning ecosystems, was significant in shaping our attitudes towards the academic kind of model now. The language in which we're taught, andragogy is a thing. Anglonormativity is a thing. The fact that we all are expected to simply know how to speak English and speak it at a particular level in a particular accent, for it to be considered legitimate. And so if you look at that across all 11 languages that we sit with, you realize that at all the tiers at which we've been cut down and at which so many previous generations have been limited from just their capacity to connect with people because of how they would connect in that way through learning. And yeah, I think that's part of one of the most heartbreaking inheritances of apartheid that we are still trying to put down today, is making peace with the things about ourselves and our communities that we simply couldn't learn then, and the things that we now have the capacity to relearn and remember, um, through our learning and through the ways we approach ecosystems of learning. So yeah, I think that's the kind of foreshadowing I just wanted to emphasize, because it wasn't just this on this day this thing happened and after that, it's, I think there are many plights around the world that pretend to give you a start date and an end date, but we know that that's not really how the apartheid system and the legacy works or functions even today. So yeah, I just thought that was important to mention.
Oh, and Courtney, so much the point so much still stands about how that is the legacy today, because people might be swayed to say things like, oh, but access is now equal, people can have access, it's not bantu education anymore, so why are you sitting around having this conversation today? But my goodness, is that a more wrong statement couldn't be made, because equality does not exist. It doesn't play out like that in reality. And there's so many factors. You touched on a multitude of them. There are all the others: access to the resources that enable learning, access to lights at night, access to a warm bed, a good meal. Sena's reading a book that she quotes very frequently around poverty and what it does to the chemistry of the brain, in the fact that it prioritizes staying alive to the expense of every other need that we
Hmm.
have, for example, education, learning, and growth. So, and we actually, we know things like like how many schools still use pit latrines instead of having access to proper bathrooms. What does that mean for children? Not only the horror stories of children being lost in pit latrines, falling into them. We've got a system. Obviously, we use that system called quintiles, which classifies schools according to their
Hmm.
socioeconomic status, and we know that the schools in the 1 to 3 quintile, which predominantly serve Black working class communities and children, we know that they're sharing textbooks. We know that that access to getting to school, travel, all of these things are really, really, really challenging. We've got a matric pass rate that is that is 80%. But that doesn't look at what the journey from grade 1 through to matric actually looks like. We know that only 4 in 10 end up passing through matric, those that start. So it is most definitely not equal. And I guess I'd like to ask Katy, because Katy, you did mention that you've worked in other schools. You mentioned Zimbabwe. I think you mentioned Mozambique as well. Have you seen a similar level of this kind of two-tiered approach to education, where you've got access for the privileged and then access for the majority?
So I think that in every I don't want to say every country, but everywhere that I've been, including the UK, you have tiered systems. So in the UK, most people would go to a government school. However, depending on the location of that school and the demographic of that school and because it's the surrounding area, the socioeconomics then of who's in that school will fundamentally give you a different experience to being in another locality. And so I was speaking to some teachers recently who'd locumed in the UK, and they were telling me their absolute horror stories of teaching in London. Meanwhile, my experience in the school I taught in was amazing. So I think that it's not necessarily. I think the thing for me in South Africa, I mean, Mozambique has its own poverty issues, like way beyond what we're experiencing here. So they have day schools and night schools, and you go to one or the other because they can't cater for everyone. And yeah, the challenges there are I would say much more deeply rooted, like in deeper poverty than here in South Africa. Yet, I think the challenge we have here is this hold of apartheid and colonialism that lives on, and that the apartheid system was so intentional about ensuring that people of color, but black people especially, did not get access to education. Um, that and again, the language. I mean, in Mozambique, you'll go to school, but you learn in Portuguese, and a lot of the kids growing up will be learning Portuguese. In the rural areas, it would be a different story. But here, the fact that from grade 4 you can't learn in your mother tongue, um, that for me is fundamentally a challenge, that means that the things that we're dealing with, perhaps on a surface level, the deeper roots of changing a system, an educational system, so that people can learn in their mother tongue, that's again another huge layer to what we need to look at. Um, a lady recently said to me that she'd been helping some grade 4s with reading, and she was horrified that this grade 4 child was there with a cat. And I said, but would you be horrified at an English speaking grade 4 child sitting there and sounding out Inja, Inja? So we wouldn't be, because we'd say, well, that's age appropriate. They're sounding out words. And so the fact that it's seen as horrific that these children around the country, when we look at our reading levels, are not proficient in English, that well, the English constituents are not proficient in isiZulu. So why would it be any different in the learning journey? And so as soon as you hit grade 4, you're on the back foot. You like, we're not just talking about learning English. You now got to I once said to some grade 6s about, imagine having to learn every subject now, your maths, your social science, your natural science, in Portuguese. And the one boy just chirped, "Yeah, maths is hard enough in English." And I said, exactly. How are you meant to even begin to learn mathematics and social science and natural science in a foreign language? So I just see that these parts of our system are still just contributing so much to the challenges.
Yeah, Katie, and so much of it is exactly that more psychological architecture as well of who is getting access and speaking in a certain language, and therefore we will equate it with intelligence and proficiency. And it's so harrowing. And I want to speak now about something you mentioned, Katie, your experience in more Model C schools, because the apartheid government exactly created these layers of schools, and Model C schools were former only white schools that was semi-privatized in the early 90s to then allow black students in. But what happened is that the culture didn't really change. So the state was still paying teachers, but then the governing body started gaining a little bit more power because they could raise funds to maintain a certain standard, and they could have control over culture, curriculum, and basically the school may have changed in its demographic, but for all intents and purposes, it remained white. And Courtney, you've spoken about attending a prestigious school as a colored woman from Cape Town on scholarship. Can you tell us, just from a personal perspective, what that experience must have been like for you as this adolescent kid coming into that space?
Yeah, I think it requires you to be a chameleon of sorts. I think cultural chameleonism is a thing on many young people navigating this, like people who are historically disenfranchised and now have to navigate a space of privilege. I think cultural chameleonism is something that they heavily lean into from a place of survival. And I think for myself, there were definitely parts of myself that I kept hidden in a space that I knew was just looking for a reason to bring out all the stereotypes that they'd already believed to be true about me. And so from the students to the teachers, like I was hit left, right, and center with all sorts of comments. Oh, you probably sleep with a knife under your pillow because you're colored and from Cape Town. Like those kind of macro aggressions were very clear, very obvious, not subtle at all. Um, and I remember at some point I started playing into it because I was like, oh, let me actually have some fun with this. And I remember being in a classroom, and there was this group of boys, and at that time, like we have co-ed classes from grade 10 up, and so we were mixed with boys, and so our teacher was having some banter with the boys, and they were like looking over at me, and they used to call our table like the KFC corner because that's where all the people of color sat. So that was just like a known thing in the classroom, that that's the KFC corner. And so they said something, oh, KFC corner, and mentioned something about like, oh yeah, but you have to be careful because Courtney's from Cape Town, like she'll stab you. And I was like, well, if you show up to my like boarding house after this, let's make that true. And I said this to the teacher, and he just looked at me and he was like, and I was like, yeah, it's awkward now, isn't it? Because I called you out on your bluff. And I remember like years after, this teacher posted something about it on Facebook. Like I wish I still had that screenshot. Um, but someone had said something that's like, yeah, I'm still afraid of Courtney. And I was like, yeah, you should be. Um, because these are the archetypes that you're presenting people with, and saying like, oh, it's actually okay to dehumanize someone for the sake of a joke because it emphasizes my level of privilege. So those kind of experiences were not uncommon for not just myself, but other people who look like me navigating that environment. And I think at some point, because I was funded and because I knew my vulnerabilities within that space, I knew that I had to be excellent. There was no other option for me but to be excellent. So it was excellence or death. And I think that's a thing many Black people navigate in South Africa, this expectation of having to survive by being excellent, not just by being a person or by being a human being. I have to be brilliant all the time, every time. And that is the only thing that can counterbalance anything else that's going around in a world that rejects me. And so I think it took me many years after that to unlearn this thing of excellence or death, because I think Black people, we die of Black social death every day in the face of the disparity we face. And so to have had that experience in my teens, and then to go to a place like Australia afterwards to go and coach and engage with people there and look at the parallels, and then be told like, because I was like, where can I connect with communities like who are working with Aboriginal like development and with women and children particularly. And I went to the Heritage Center to find this information out. And the lady at the front desk literally just looked at me and she's like, oh, you have to go to the wild. And I'm like, I'm not looking for kangaroos or koalas. Like I'd like to connect with some people, and I know that they exist. And she tells me, no, no, no. You can go to the outback for that. You can go to the wild. And I literally did. I booked a trip to the outback, random, some bucky, some uncle dropped me in the desert somewhere. And I connected with people, and I was like, I'm so sorry that you aren't even considered human. And I think like looking at a place like Australia where Aboriginal people were classified as fauna and flora up until the 80s. My mother was born in the 60s. And so she could have easily been classified as fauna and flora had she been born on a different continent. And so now you take that kind of insight and you bring it back here and you consider the levels of dehumanization that has happened at every tier. So by the time I'd left, my perception of my community and my perception of that community that I was also part of was so polarized, because there's this universe that you exist in when you're at home, and then there's this universe that you have to protect yourself within when you're at school. And I mean, I was at boarding school. That's where I spent 90% of my year for 5 years. So if you think of 5 years of that kind of languaging, of that kind of treatment, it definitely can have an effect on your perception of self and your self-worth, but also because you're constantly measuring yourself against this excellence thing, for the sake of survival. I think for me, I'd really, my grounding and my upbringing and being the daughter of an activist, being the daughter of people, like I grew up around Fanon and Biko on the bookshelves. There was nothing that school was going to be able to do to me to have shaken me. But I saw what it did to my peers who didn't have that kind of grounding. I saw how long it took after school for them to recover from that. And that's why I did my honors thesis looking at the disenfranchised groups having to navigate like spaces of privilege, but like opulence. So what does it mean for someone who has nothing to navigate a universe that has everything and be expected to show up authentically? Like what are we asking of these kids who we give scholarships to and we tell them go and be great and then expect them to fly, when the infrastructure, even psychologically, is not there to keep them in a place of groundedness in an environment that wasn't designed for them to flourish. So I think there's so many ways that my upbringing and my grounding growing up steadied me in my experience to the point where I could be aware of these things and not take it personally and come out on the other side mostly unscathed and still quite self-aware. Um, but it is heartbreaking to see that like the people around me didn't necessarily have that. And the damage that it's done to a lot of my peers is something that I often think about having to rehabilitate as someone that did make it to the other side with myself intact.
Oh, Courtney, the number of things that you said there that just Sen and I were having a conversation a while back, reflecting on some of the episodes that we've had and noticing quite a trend, which is that people of color, as parents, have tended to spend, out of necessity, out of survival needs, to spend a lot of time teaching their children about the dynamics of power. Everything that you spoke about there, what it means to be a person of color in a white world, especially in the face of the Eurocentric view that everything is now equal, in front of that rhetoric and constantly being faced with it. Whereas, and I can say this from my own perspective, whereas parents of white children, which are typically white parents, except in my case, tend to spend a lot of time supporting their children with their academics and helping them focus on their sports and teaching them how to do debating, but for fairly superficial topics. And I think the point is there isn't this deep engagement with the politics of power, both intellectually, both experience based, etc. And I think what it is continuing to perpetuate is a lot of what you spoke about there, even in today's context, which is a non-understanding of how things are actually playing out in reality for people of color, even when the legal system is obviously supportive of equal education and equality. And I guess that's a little bit of context, Katy, to something I want to ask you, which is really from the perspective of a white woman who is in South Africa, not necessarily from South Africa. No, not necessarily. Definitely not. Fundamentally not from South Africa. Do you notice or pick up any of these racial biases or subtle forms of racism in the school system? Are you able to see them? Have you noticed any?
Oh goodness, I mean they're everywhere. Um, so I when I spend time in schools and training teachers and running workshops, one of the things we explicitly do is think about the fact that our schools have become more multiracial, but they haven't become more multicultural. And so we then break down what that looks like in real terms. So, what is the music that is played at school events? Is it still very Eurocentric, or is there music there for everyone? If food, what food is being served? Again, at events or in the school canteen or whatever it is. And then how are people allowed to eat their food? Must they eat with a knife and fork, or can they use a spoon, or can they use their hands? Um, the kinds of uniforms. Where do they come from? What's their past? What's the heritage that's being expressed through them? Um, the yeah, there's so many elements, and then just the I know one school who recently um, took down. So a lot of these, like if we talk about Model C schools, a lot of them have the hallways lined with the pictures of all the past heads, and photos going back yonder years, and how that speaks to a child of this is a place that has belonged to white people forever. You've been included into it, and that's where the word inclusion doesn't always help us. You've been included rather than this is a space that needs transforming, and this is a place where we want justice and equity, and belonging. And if we talk about belonging, well, then if you feel you don't belong when there's just all these plaques and all these pictures that tell you this isn't a space for you, can we take them down? Can we move them to an archive room? What can we do? And there is a school in Cape Town that's done just that. They've taken down all these pictures. And that's a journey for a school to be on, because there's, of course, going to be your alumni who are proud of their heritage and their history, and they don't want that kind of change. But for a school to decide, okay, we are intentionally going to look at what are the ways, let's create safe spaces to have authentic conversations, and then what are the ways that we need to be having these real, making these changes. Yeah, the music for me is always a big one, in just helping people think about how I said this week to a staff body, like, for a white person, you've got the music's playing, all the Eurocentric beats that you're used to, and then a track starts, and I'll hear someone say something like, "Oh my goodness, what is this? Why did the DJ just change the music?" Meanwhile, the demographic that has just stood up, who are now like, "Yeah, like we're getting down. These are our beats." They haven't sat there for the previous 45 minutes saying, what is this music? And so helping everyone understand that we are seeing everything through the perspective of our life experience, and we need to challenge our perspectives on the world around us, and not just tolerate difference, but really embrace it and celebrate it and accept it.
Katie, everything you just said, they're giving that example of the school that has now gone and kept some of the historical artifacts in archives. I sit here speaking to you as a woman that went to a university named after a mass murderer and genocidal maniac. And the argument is always, so multi-layered and so many different stakeholders, and it really doesn't even hold weight. But what I want to ask you, in your experience of going into these spaces, going into these schools that have enjoyed massive privilege, and what I know about privilege is that the people that hold it hardly ever willingly give it up. How how do you make sure that in going into these spaces you are not being used as an accessory to be a tick box exercise? And do you witness any political will from these institutions that have existed for years looking a certain way? What is the political will to actually change that versus it being performative? And how do you decipher?
Oh, that's such a good question too. So that's part of what I challenge in the space. I use the metaphor of a boat, a sailing boat. So a sailing boat has a mainsail, and for me, that is our transformation policies and frameworks. It's our compliance documents. It's our tick boxes. Like this, we have to transform. We have to be more diverse and inclusive. But the real power is in the jib sail. And the jib for me is the little sail that you put up to go further, faster. That's your justice, inclusion, and belonging. Where you genuinely, your motivation is on people feeling that they belong by bringing about justice and really creating spaces where everyone genuinely feels included. That's a journey, but that's what will take us further faster. And so if the motivation is tick boxes, nothing's going to change. But if our motivation is, I often say, like, we shouldn't be doing this because we have to. We should be doing this because we get to. So when I ask people, if you could go back to the inception of apartheid or colonialism and you could stop it in its tracks, would you? And most people are like, yeah, they would. Whether it's because it would be comfortable or whether it's because they know it's what they should do, that most people would. If people are thinking, oh, I don't know if I would, then that gives them their own dialogue, internal dialogue to think about. But so if you would stop it in its tracks, then the challenge is that we can't change history, but we can write a better future. And so if we can intentionally write a better future, that's all we can do to make ourselves, I don't know, feel like we wish we could have stopped it. That's the conviction. So I often talk about don't feel guilty about the past, feel convicted about what you're doing about the future. I think a lot of people sit with white guilt, and guilt doesn't get us anywhere. We just sit in our whirlpool. And so rather feel convicted about the fact that you've had all this privilege. The quote I heard this week was, I wish I could remember who said it. Um, the problem with those that have privileged feel like equality is unfair. And I was just
Oh,
like, whoa,
yeah.
if you're privileged, you feel that equality is unfair. And so how do we just say, actually, I get to be part of writing a better future? I like not because I have to, but because I want to. I want a world where everyone feels they belong.
Katy, obviously a topic for another day, but that quote I think is so, so relevant. And the it seems to be like the fundamental basis of this whole there's no space for white men in our country. That really is how we would summarize that conversation. But as I say, conversation for another day. What I think you have so beautifully laid out is the possibility to reimagine the future. And I would love to ask Courtney. Courtney, we've spoken about, in fact, you said it so beautifully here, violence in the space of learning historically. And what do you see as the way that we can kind of reimagine the future for education in our country and for equality at its base?
I think that's a good question when we consider that I think conflict is part of learning, right? And so how do we remove the violence without removing the conflict and the value that conflict brings to learning? Because I think learning sites are always a place of contention. That's what spurs the growth. That's what creates an environment where you can harness the tension. And I think that's what we're trying to do. I think that's what Katy was also emphasizing is like if we're going to be part of driving this thing forward, we have to harness the difference for us to actually get there. And the difference isn't in the fact that we're not the same. The difference is in our approach to perceiving ourselves among each other. So if I can perceive other people to having the same innate human value that I do, chances are I'm going to be able to treat myself and them better, not just them. I think there's a massive deficit in self-awareness, self-compassion, and self-fullness, not to be confused with selflessness. Self-fullness is an awareness that I need to be able to nourish, protect, and care for myself in a way that I can extend that care to my community. And so when you think of learning systems of the future, to me, that's the heart of it. Like wellness at the center of learning is what creates creative capacity. And if there's creative capacity, there's innovation potential. And so in order to be able to build that at scale in a country that is so historically backlogged in our wellness, in our learning, in our ability to just simply hold ourselves as human, um, I think the exciting part about dreaming into the futures is like you build it now. I think in futures thinking, we talk about the thick present. It means the future is not vacant. We've already started constructing it now. And so that means you're already part of it, whether you see yourself there or not. I think it's sometimes difficult to ask kids who don't have creative capacity because they have been living in a place of survival for so long to dream of anything beyond the survival. It's almost cruel to expect that of them, to be able to be like, go and be innovative, go and be a child when you have been parentalized, at such a young age. And so I think to me, the future is a really exciting place where children get to be children again. And what does that mean for how we learn and how we look at learning, not only in its modalities and methodologies? You were talking about pedagogy and andragogy earlier, and I was thinking, utagogy is there too. We peer-to-peer learning is not even something we've been able to touch because we are so disconnected and disenfranchised from the idea of community learning and community owned knowledge practices, which goes far beyond what any single institution can accredit you for. That's part of how you are aware of and connect with your immediate environment and the people that navigate that with you. That's your primary learning function. So by the time I do step into a classroom, I know how to socialize, I know how to speak, I know how to respect, I know what respect means at a tangible level. It means when I sit next to my friend, I'm not poking them all the time. It means that I give them and respect their personal space when they tell me no. Because at home, I haven't been learned how to say no or how to receive no. And so those kind of micro things that we don't even consider a significant part of how we retain and receive knowledge, I think the future presents so many amazing opportunities because of what people are presently doing, because of how people are currently challenging this notion that children have to be excellent for them to be legitimate. My kid is only my kid if they go get into university, then I claim them as mine. But when they fail and they do not so well, how do I treat them? How do I speak to them? So at every tier within the ecosystem, everyone has a responsibility, whether you're a parent, whether you're someone in the governing body, whether you're a custodian at a school simply sweeping the classroom to keep it clean. You have just much an input into a learning ecosystem as anyone else. And I think we have an opportunity to finally minimize the hierarchies that legitimize who we are within learning spaces. We can simply show up as ourselves and say, I'm here to learn in collective, but I'm also taking responsibility of how I learn in that collective. And I think that's a big part of the agency conversation many South Africans aren't ready to have because of the woundedness of what the system has done. And I don't blame people who go to schools and say, the government owes me this school doesn't want to do this for my child. And I'm like, I hear that. Whether I agree with it or not is something else, but I truly hear the wound of where that is coming from. And I think the possibility of what like speculative futures in learning presents us with is how to bring creative healing modalities back into spaces of learning where we can reconnect with that humanity and then extend it beyond, okay, so now that I actually know how to be a human being again, how can I be a student? How can I be a scholar? How can I be a teacher? I mean, all the teachers I think in public schools right now need a gap year. Every single one of them, whether they are teaching in Kailicha or Nyanga or whether they're teaching at Bishops, all of them need a gap year to really just remember, like, who am I outside of trauma management and managing a system that is so new? I think people forget our democracy city is young, and we're trying to compete with systems that have had democracy for hundreds of years, who have had institutions facilitating democratic learning in a particular way for hundreds of years. We're playing catch up, and we're trying to say we're competing among people who have had a very different trajectory than we have. And I think by bringing ourselves towards ourselves and saying, actually, within our own context, what do we need? And how can we co create that with ourselves presents us with a much more tangible and active future than something that we simply receive from people we think we're competing against. So, all these other European models of learning, all the other kinds of structures of learning that aren't indigenously focused, that aren't rooted in context, won't last very long because they weren't designed by us for us. And so, I think the future really presents so many exciting opportunities for us to remember how to do that and for us to kind of recreate and possibly reimagine what that can feel like at a very visceral sensorial level, in a way that we simply have not had the luxury to think of before.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Katie, I'm interested to get your view on how we can begin to reimagine our education in the future. But I also must mention that anybody who is from South Africa will notice that you may have been from the UK and you speak in a very British accent. Your surname is Mthethwa and you are a white woman. So if you can touch on how do we begin to reimagine the future, and you have a very unique perspective on what white people's role is in all of this as well.
Yeah, so I guess how I've ended up doing what I'm doing is because I've journeyed married to a Zulu man for 17 going on 18 years, and we have three beautiful daughters who are first generation mixed race, and for whom, yeah, they walk into spaces and they often don't feel that they are seen as their whole self. That's the best way to put it, I think. So my daughters will say about different spaces, like, "Oh, I really felt that they saw the Zulu part of me." Or felt that I feel like I fit in here because there's lots of people of a similar skin color, so I don't stand out. Or I feel, and so on a very surface level, they feel that sense of belonging or not, and yeah, we are faced with lots of interesting situations, as I'm sure you can imagine. Um, but for me, the real joy of what I'm doing is reimagining what it looks like for our children to grow up knowing the truth about our history, our South African history, so that they can intentionally write a different future. So Stacey mentioned the videos, the public holiday videos earlier. If our children don't know our history, then they can't intentionally write an informed future. Um, they kids will fill in the gaps to explain the world around them if they're not given the truth. Or they'll believe what they're told about the world around them that is not the truth. And so yeah, the curriculum that I have in schools, we have these real conversations where students, you talked earlier about respect, where students learn what respect is in different contexts for different cultures. Children get to talk about their own identity. I've been fascinated in finding out that a lot of kids don't know their own cultural identity. And a lot of our kids are growing up with fractured cultural identities because they are from different ethnic backgrounds, and their parents can't even speak the same language. And so these third culture kids, how do we give them a sense of identity, and then enable them to see that there's space for everyone else around them as well? So for me, to be able to have these conversations, and as kids form their neural pathways, make them aware of the truth about South Africa and be able to talk about identity in a healthy way, that's a huge part of how I would like to shape the future.
Oh, thank you, Katy. I think there is a challenge towards being intentional in the space of all places where we touch children's lives. So, as parents, as friends, as grandparents, around, as you've just said, relooking history. I think it's also completely and utterly reframing history to show people what truth actually looks like, as instead of this colonial lens that we've all been spoon fed. And I think, or spoon fed to believe is truth, you know. And Katy, something I probably just want to share as well is, so my children were born closer. They're Black. They were adopted into my family when they were 4 months old. And one of the challenges that I have as a white parent is that I cannot and will never understand the experiences that they're faced with, and I find that deeply disempowering as a parent who cares for their children. But what I and which therefore spurs me to take action and research further and be intentional. But what I really struggle with is where people will use that, and perhaps your circumstance as well, with having mixed race children, as a reason to motivate why you might want to engage in these conversations and be intentional. And I really do want to share that that is absolutely not okay, and that us as the recipients of generations of privilege, that is entirely the opposite of how we should be acting, and that intentionality is absolutely the way forward. So thank you to you both, Courtney and Katy, for sharing such beautiful, articulate perspectives that really challenge us as humans to relook this education system, because it is how it is, not by mistake, but completely and utterly by design. And therefore, that for us is actually opportunity. So a beautiful discussion, one I feel like I could have for hours and hours on end. Thank you. Really, a big fat thank you. Guys, we're going to ask Courtney to see if she can locate her picture from when she was in school. And we're going to share that on our socials. We'd love if you guys could follow us too. Please, you'll find Colourful Podcast on TikTok and on Instagram. And obviously, please follow us YouTube, Spotify, Apple. Guys, if you are educators, we've actually had a couple of teachers reach out to us and say that they'd like to use our podcast as a resource in their classrooms. Please do. Sen and I are very happy to make ourselves available to come and guest speak at them, run some workshops. We really, really need this kind of conversation to be happening in schools, and we're happy to support. So until next time, guys.